Thank you. So this is kind of take two on the session that you would have heard from me a couple of weeks ago. As I said then, and as I'll say again now, it's almost impossible to extrapolate the economics of these countries from the international relations. Obviously we've done it a little bit arbitrarily just to allow these sessions to occur. To some extent they cross over, so apologies for that. I'm talking about the bottom billion, which by and large is going to refer to sub-Saharan Africa, some countries in Latin America, and some other random countries like Haiti. So that's what you should kind of have in your mind. Quickly, let's talk about the developing world though. There are a number of kind of misnomers that are used. The first is the third world. I would advise you against using that ever, because the actual term doesn't make sense in the world as it exists today. The second and third worlds were terms that we used when there was a USSR. The second world referred to communist countries. The third world referred to non-communist, poorer countries. It literally doesn't make any sense anymore, so don't use it. The developing world is another one that I would not advocate, because it's essentially meaningless. Any category that groups together China and India and Brazil with Sudan and Western Sahara is not a useful category. It's not meaningful. It is nothing. So do not use it. The category that's kind of available in the literature nowadays is something to do with like the bottom billion, or you could name a whole bunch of other things. By and large though, there is a really important differentiation between countries that are developing, insofar as they are actually developing, they are growing, their country is doing something, and countries who are not, countries who are stagnant, countries whose economies are going nowhere, countries who have perhaps limited prospects. So that's the differentiation I'm trying to get into your brain. I will be talking about that latter category of countries. I will not be talking about Brazil and China and India, because we do not, unfortunately, have time. So people kind of clear on that differentiation of what I'm talking about. That'll become clearer when we talk about examples later. Stephen, did you have a question?
I was just going to say, like, everybody in Europe apparently really likes the term the global south.
Yeah.
Is that as well as non-specific as the...
Yeah, I mean, for me, any geographical representation is meaningless, because there are countries who exist in what I will describe the bottom billion, who are in the north and the south and the west and the east. So I think it's basically useless. I would probably advise against it. Like, it's often referred to as the east as well, which is basically nothing.
Okay.
So, to give you a brief idea of what we're talking about, and I'm aware that some of these statistics go beyond the bottom billion by virtue of the fact that there are more than 1 billion people referenced in some of them. But I think they give us a general idea about what we're kind of facing in these countries. So, and I think this is pretty grim, so I think it's important to engage in this, and perhaps debating will move a bit more towards talking about these types of countries. Almost half the world, e.g. about 3.5 billion people, live on less than $2.50 US a day. In the bottom billion, that statistic obviously gets more grim, insofar as it's usually $1 a day, and it's most, if not everyone. The poorest 40% of the world's population accounts for 5% of global income. That shouldn't be surprising, given the recent 1%, 99%. It's probably quite expected. And the types of countries we're talking about are countries in which people don't have access to clean water, people live in poverty, there are significant issues with access to healthcare, with access to education, etc. So I think that's kind of an important context before we move into what these countries can do. The way this session is going to be structured, which I think is perhaps the slide, good on me, is going to be based around the book, The Bottom Billion, written by Paul Collier. I would advise everybody to read it. Obviously what I'm doing now is kind of a summary of the book. There is a huge amount of nuance in the book that obviously I cannot reflect in this presentation, so I would heavily advise you to read that book if you want to have any understanding of what happens in kind of poor countries, which by and large, to be honest, people in debating and also people in the world don't really have. So I would advise you to get the book and read it. I also bought my copy if someone wants to borrow it. So basically the contention of the book, and this presentation will follow this, is that there are a number of traps that countries in the bottom billion are caught in. I'm going to explain to you what they are and kind of why they're a trap and why they're cyclical and why it's difficult for countries to actually get out of them. And then we're going to look at some different solutions I've proposed. These are the 4 solutions that Collier puts forward. He advocates for all of them at different times and in different ways, and to deal with different issues. I'm also going to talk to you though about a couple of people who either disagree with him or support some of these things in different ways, e.g. Sachs and a couple of other economists. What am I doing? Okay, so let's look at this first. 73% of people in the bottom billion have recently been through or or are still currently involved in a civil war. Almost all civil wars beget, unsurprisingly, more civil wars or more conflict. So over 50% of civil wars are secondary insofar as there was conflict previously. So that is obviously a huge issue in especially sub-Saharan Africa. To be honest, that will be the major focus of this presentation. So, as I've said already, there's a hugely increased likelihood of conflict in the bottom billion. Let's talk about why. The three most influential factors, in a statistical sense, on the likelihood of you being engaged in civil war or engaged in conflict are the income of your country, like the overall amount of money that you have coming in, the growth rate of your country, so how quickly you're growing or how stagnant you are, and your degree of reliance on natural resources. Does that shock anyone? You'll note that things that are not included in that list are like the degree of ethnic diversity in your country, or religious diversity, or a whole host of other things that by and large we usually associate conflict with. Is anybody surprised that the most influential factors are money? Yeah? Well, I am personally a little bit surprised about that, and I think that it certainly points to some failures in a public policy sense, because I think that a lot of average people in the Western world would not give you that answer if you asked them what the number one cause of conflict in sub-Saharan Africa was, and I think that's a real problem. Yes?
When it talks about starting income, is it like per person or
GDP per capita?
Yeah.
How many dollars does your average guy have? So he gives some kind of quantities of that impact. So if you actually halve the starting income of a country, you double their risk of civil war in a pure, one-for-one way. And for each percentage point you add to the growth rate of a country, you knock the equivalent percentage off the likelihood of a civil war. So there is a huge impact between development and between growth and avoiding conflict, which is really important. Let's talk about why. So obviously it's kind of unsurprising that if you live in a country with an incredibly low starting income and with fairly limited prospects for growth, because you've been stagnant for however many years, that your population is relatively hopeless. You don't really have a lot to look forward to. You kind of have a crap life and you're probably not too happy. Without just kind of looking at the slides and giving me the answer that I've written there in a sentence, let's extrapolate why that might be likely to increase the likelihood of you having conflict or civil war. Yeah, Liv.
Just the fact that you, if you have a growing class divide, the fact that you are in proximity to people that are rich and you're obviously not getting any richer, or even if your country is just shit economically, but the countries around you are booming and you don't understand why.
Yeah, so in one sense it's you being poor relative to other people, but I think there's a much broader point. Sam?
There's a less to lose factor from a country point of view. You're not as connected with other countries, and from a personal point of view,
Absolutely.
Shit gets blown a bit. So.
Exactly. If you don't have a job, if you literally are idle and you do nothing, and there's pretty much nothing in your life that you're too happy about, then the likelihood that you're so disillusioned that you've been recruited by a charismatic rebel leader who gives you a gun and offers to feed you is incredibly high. So that's obviously a real issue in especially the sub-Saharan African context. Yes,
Probably also makes it easy to blame another group for it
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Your likelihood to kind of respect government institutions or want to maintain whatever the status quo is relatively low. So anyone who can promise you something a little bit better than total shit, you're probably likely to throw your support behind. That is definitely true. Unsurprisingly, those factors similarly contribute to a weak state. So when your population doesn't have a lot of money and there's no growth, your capacity as a state to tax, to do a lot of spending, to have anything that actually makes you worth keeping is pretty minimal. The likelihood that you have strong state institutions is relatively small if you're in an incredibly bad economic position. Yes, Sam?
I can't remember if I read this online. Is there a correlation between everyone's poor in your country and government is poor, there's less likely to be conflict, and there's a divide between rich and poor?
So Colin doesn't really make that argument. He is actually a lot more focused on actual poverty as opposed to relative to other people. But I'm sure that it is the case that if you can see rich people in your country, especially in the types of countries we're talking about, where those rich people usually profiteer off bad policy and a lack of governance that obviously badly affects you, then that's definitely, I would say, going to play into your likelihood of kind of getting involved in conflict. as I said earlier, dependence on natural resources also increases the likelihood of you getting involved in conflict. So there's actually a really interesting differentiation that Collier makes between a rebellion and a coup in terms of what's likely to enable those things to occur. And it is very true that there's a link between natural resources and rebellion. Kabila, who we spoke about last time, who was a rebel leader in the Congo, is quite famous for making the comment that all we need to launch a rebellion in Africa is a satellite phone. Obviously nowadays that comment's a little bit outdated, but the reason for that comment, or what that's trying to get at, is the fact that as soon as you can organise deals, as soon as you can call up a company and sell off the rights to whatever you have control of, you can fund a rebellion. And so in the Congo context, that was getting access to diamond mines, it was getting access to a whole bunch of natural resources, and basically as soon as you're in control of them, you can sell them off and you can finance the continuation of your rebel movement. It's also very true for a whole bunch of rebel movements that operate in a bunch of different sub-Saharan contexts. Also, to some extent, having a lot of natural resource money increases the payoff of being in control of that country. If you're going to be a bad guy, it's better to be a bad guy in a country that has a shitload of natural resources that you can take, sell off to your buddies and make a lot of money off, than being in a country that doesn't. So, as we've already a little bit spoken about, there are some counterintuitive things that I think it's important to keep in mind, which is that those factors we've spoken about are actually much more of a predictor of conflict than the types of things that are often mentioned in debates. Things like ethnic divides. Some of the most peaceful countries in the world have a lot of ethnic divides, and some of the most homogenous countries in the world, e.g. Somalia, are a piece of shit. So sometimes we overestimate the degree to which ethnicities just can't get along. Social and political rights. We often in the West assume that the reason for rebellion is that you do not have democratic rights, because it's something we value and it's something we assume everybody else values. Collier makes the argument that that's not really true, and he actually points to the fact that civil war and conflict is just as likely in democratic poor countries as it is in autocratic poor countries. Because the thing that defines your likelihood of engaging in a rebellion is not whether or not you can vote in an election, but it's whether or not you actually have the capacity to defend yourself. So I think that's a really important thing, and it certainly, for me, makes an important statement about which one of those things is prioritised. And obviously Collier in Guns, Wars and Votes, for anybody who's read it, essentially makes the argument that poor countries should absolutely prioritise economic development and not the development of political institutions. And then geography is the third one. Many people in MAD like to make a lot of arguments about geography and its effect on war. It certainly does have an effect, and there's a number of famous people who have written books, like Kaplan, whose Revenge of Geography essentially makes the argument that geography is the most determinative in terms of when conflict is likely to occur. There's no doubt that it is. If you have mountains, you're much more likely to have a rebellion because there's places for people to hide. However, it's much less of a factor than all that economic stuff. So I think those are some important things to remember. Often in debating, we lie about why conflict occurs and how we can solve it. The reason it's a trap should be unsurprising. When you go through a civil war, it's very costly, and it puts you in a worse economic position, usually, than you began. Collier estimates it at about $64 billion as a cost just to you and your immediate neighbours. So that's not a cost to everybody in the world by virtue of that civil war. It's just you and the people who are very close to you. And he himself claims that that's quite a conservative estimate of the cost of like an average civil war in sub-Saharan Africa. And most of the costs occur for the years after that war. So obviously the biggest factor that kills people in wars in the modern day is not actual fighting, but it's things like disease and displacement and malnutrition. And those are things that are particularly true in wars that happen in sub-Saharan Africa. And the final factor that kind of makes these things a trap and makes them cyclical and likely to continue to occur is that when you have a coup or a rebellion, you kind of create a context in which those things seem more reasonable. You create a precedent for those things occurring, and it makes people feel more comfortable to engage in those things in the future. And there are a number of countries where this is very obvious. There are plenty of countries in Africa that have had 7, 8, 12 coups, because basically once it happens once, other people get the idea and think that's probably a good way to go. Second thing I want to talk about is natural resources. Natural resources is one of those things that I think is really counterintuitive, because it's really easy to presume that because a country has a crap load of oil, they're just likely to be rich. And we've all got a picture in our mind of Saudi Arabia, and we think it must be the case. In actual fact, it's very unlikely to be the case. So about 30% of people who live in the bottom billion in the world live in countries whose economies are totally dominated by natural resources. Obviously, as I've already said, it contributes to some extent to the likelihood of conflict. However, that's not the only impact of natural resources. Even in times of peace, countries with natural resources are fairly unlikely to grow in the bottom billion, which I think is personally something that is quite counterintuitive, and so it's important to think about. There's a number of explanations for why that's the case, and one of the most obvious ones, one of the ones that's most often leveraged, is Dutch disease. Without reading that, has anyone ever heard of that word? Okay, Rowan, shoot.
So it's because you're selling so much stuff, the level of your currency appreciates or is worth more compared to the US dollar, and therefore it makes it harder for people to develop industries in their own country.
Yeah, exactly right. So essentially Dutch disease even is the description given to when you have a huge boom in something and the value of your currency skyrockets, which basically makes any other thing you might export totally uncompetitive. Beaver.
It's like literally what's happening to our economy now with all the mining stuff.
Absolutely what's happening to our economy now. So things like Australian manufacturing is now going to be much harder to export by virtue of the strength of the Australian dollar, thanks to WA. So this is an argument that's pretty regularly made and I think is pretty decent. And a great example of it is Nigeria. And it's true of many different decades in Nigeria, but I think this one in particular, which is during the 70s. Obviously, well, hopefully we all know that during the 70s there was a bit of a tizzy with oil. And there was a real boom in the price of oil. And Nigeria, their main export is oil. During that same period, the other major exports in Nigeria, which are cocoa and peanuts, that's their 2 and 3 exports, the bottom totally fell out of those industries. They couldn't export them at all because they were totally uncompetitive.
How many peanuts go
Yeah, exactly, that's right. So another aspect or another explanation that's often given as to why natural resources can be a real economic curse for poor countries is the way that commodity exports or the commodity market works. Which is that it tends to be very boom and bust. The price of commodities tends to be very cyclical and skyrocket and then plummet. And that's certainly true in the types of commodities that are exported from the bottom billion countries. So obviously one of the major ones is oil, but a lot of food exports as well, a lot of other mineral exports, they tend to be very up and down. So what happens in that process is basically, and strangely enough, again, this is kind of counterintuitive. When the price of, for example, oil skyrockets and Nigeria has a shitload of money coming in from oil, credit markets absolutely open up to Nigeria. Anybody and everybody will lend them money. And I'm using Nigeria, obviously, as an example. This is true in many other instances as well. And of course, if you're a poor country who by and large has not had access to international credit and by and large is underdeveloped and has a whole lot of stuff that you as a government want to spend on, you're going to take advantage of the access to credit. You're going to take out a lot of loans. And this is true in a number of different circumstances. Unfortunately, what happens when that plummets, when, for example, Saudi Arabia decides they will start selling oil again, is that you now are left with debts that you cannot service and that you cannot pay off. This is like a thing that's very, very regular. The other kind of complexity here is obviously that might be okay if you were a good government and you spent that money really well and then you diversified your economy such that you were no longer reliant upon natural resources. You might be able to pay that back. Unsurprisingly, a lot of these countries also don't have particularly good governance, and so the types of projects that are funded in times when they're awash with money are not necessarily the most productive for the rest of the economy. Third thing that I think is really important is it's hard for electorates to hold governments accountable when they operate on a boom and bust natural resources or commodity cycle. And to take Nigeria as an example again, it was very unclear when Nigeria were left essentially in an economic wasteland whose fault it was. To some extent, it could perhaps be blamed on the government and the fact that they spent the money quite badly. To some extent, it was blamed by the government on the IMF loans they'd received during that period of time and a whole bunch of other private loans they'd received during that period of time. And the silly thing is, even in the context in which that government spent that money very badly, people in Nigeria, by and large, were still better off. And so the fact that they were only slightly better off, as opposed to heaps better off as they should have been, meant that it was very hard for them to actually engage in what you would normally see in a kind of democratic situation, where governments would be held accountable for not making the most out of those commodity booms. That's very hard to do. So, that's a problem. Commodity exports also reduce the likelihood of democracy. As I've already said, they make it more likely that you have conflict. They make it more likely that you have things like rebellions. So that gets you essentially trapped back in the conflict trap, which is a real problem for countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Natural resources can also have the effect of reducing the functionality of democracy. So, democracy in the bottom billion is not like democracy in Australia. Unsurprisingly, the types of regulations that surround how governments can operate and the way they can spend their money are not necessarily as developed as what you would expect, what you'd be accustomed to in a modern democracy. So, one of the major things that governments do in quote-unquote democratic countries in the bottom billion is they pay for support. Patronage is a huge issue in those countries. And so whilst you might think it would be really good to have a significant amount of money coming in every year from natural resources, or to go through a boom where the value of oil skyrockets, in general, it just increases the likelihood that those democracies are dysfunctional. It increases the capacity for patronage to be the number one thing that determines who gets elected in your country, and it increases the likelihood that governments just pay for support. And Collier gives some numbers to this. He says that where 20% of government income is resource-based, electoral competition actually lowers the rate of growth by about 3%, and the reason for that is because the electoral competition is simply patronage. It's a question of who can give out the most money and who can buy the most votes. It has absolutely nothing to do with who can govern the country the best or who's likely to institute the best policies once they do get into power. So I won't go through the rest of those numbers, but I think that's a really important thing to engage in. Simply giving more money to governments who don't necessarily know what they're doing, or pushing more money into democracies where regulation is lax, does not improve the likelihood that those countries are going to grow necessarily. The reason why it's a trap, and therefore hard to kind of overcome, is obvious, right? Because all of those things that I said about democracies apply, that it's very hard to diversify your economy when your economy is so heavily dominated by natural resources because everything else is uncompetitive. It's incredibly difficult to deal with. As I said, it also increases your likelihood of being engaged in conflict. So, the third trap that Collier points to is this one, which is essentially being landlocked and having shitty neighbours. Unsurprisingly, this applies to many, if not most, countries in sub-Saharan Africa and quite a number of others. So around a fifth of the world's countries are landlocked. Being landlocked does not necessarily mean your country cannot grow. There are plenty of tiny countries in Europe that are landlocked who are doing very well. However, it does make things much more difficult. The reason why those countries are doing well is because their neighbours are other rich countries who have incredibly good governance and who, incidentally, are likely to have roads that can actually get you to the sea. They're likely to let you use those roads to get to ports. That is not the case in sub-Saharan Africa. So, unsurprisingly, landlocked countries are reliant on their neighbours to actually access any kind of sea freight. Sea freight, as much as we might think it's kind of Industrial Revolution old school, is still a huge thing. This is how we freight up most things still in the world. Don't laugh. People have told us in many debates that it's not even news. So, think about this as an example. In order for Uganda to try and export anything or freight anything by sea, it's reliant on the infrastructure of Kenya, Sudan, Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Tanzania. Now, that's a little bit less true than insofar as, Kenya has a government, and Tanzania has a government, and they might have some roads to ports, maybe, although some of those countries won't. The bigger problem is not just that you might be surrounded by countries whose access to ports is itself relatively limited. The other problem is that you might be surrounded by countries who hate you in Africa. So, as an example, Ethiopia is reliant upon going through Eritrea to actually access ports. If you know anything about Africa, you will know Ethiopia and Eritrea don't get along. And they've essentially been in a war for the past 40 years. So, obviously, it's a little bit difficult. Collier has a pretty bleak assessment of the prospects of landlocked countries in sub-Saharan Africa. He essentially says they're going to be on international aid forever, or at least for a very long time. But there are some things that we could do to improve the prospects of those countries. First is increasing the growth of their neighbours. The best thing you can do for a crappy, tiny country who's landlocked is ensure that their neighbours are big enough that they can use them as a market, that they can just export services or they can export goods to their immediate neighbours and they don't ever need to freight anything by sea. Also, the more developed those economies become, the more likely they are to themselves have good corridors for transport of products that those other countries are more likely to be able to take control of or use. And obviously, as they grow, they're more likely to have good governance, they're less likely to have conflict, they're perhaps less likely to be engaged in civil war or alternatively war with you. So those things are good. The second one I've just spoken about. The third one is really important. Collier makes the argument that if we're going to give international aid to landlocked countries, we should actually forget entirely about trying to restructure their economies or do things differently. And we should essentially pump money exclusively into building some fucking roads from the places they need to build stuff to the sea. And that's pretty much what the international community can and should do exclusively. The fourth suggestion he gives for these countries who don't have much hope is that they can become kind of a haven for the region. And I think this was a good point when Tim pointed to, what was it?
Latvia.
Yeah, as being an example of Europe. And obviously there are some other examples of countries that kind of weirdly have a monopoly over stuff. That's kind of something that, you know, can be done. And certainly in financial services, it's easy to do it even if you're a small kind of shitty economy. And especially if you're landlocked, it doesn't particularly matter. The third, or the fifth rather, thing that he suggests is that you can do business by air. Certainly if you're a poor country and if you're far away from a lot of stuff, that's almost impossible. But some countries in kind of northern Africa do have access to some air freighter. Or more importantly, that you can do business on the internet.
Okay.
Obviously, if you're a landlocked country in sub-Saharan Africa, the likelihood that you have an educated population is relatively low, and the likelihood that you have access to, for example, internet that functions and computers is fairly low. However, those things can be fixed, but I think the important point is that if you're a landlocked country, your capacity to go through the usual stages of industrialization, where you become like a manufacturing economy first, and then develop tertiary industry, is basically non-existent. You can't be, or at least not sustainably, a manufacturing or producing country. So if the international community is going to do anything, it has to be to essentially allow you to skip that step and provide tertiary services that can be done via the internet, for example. The sixth thing, and this is pretty grim when you're starting to rely on this as an economic policy, is to just educate some people, get them jobs in other places, and hope they will send you money. It's not great. The seventh thing, which I think is pretty funny, is to create an environment in which people might want to prospect for natural resources, because at least you might have some hope of getting out of the natural resource trap, perhaps slightly more than you will have of getting new borders that allow you access to the sea. And then the final thing, and I think the most important thing, is aid. So the reason why I'm trying to get to this is because very regularly countries who are poor are lumped together, as if the problems of poverty are exactly the same in every single country, and the type of solution you might engage in is exactly the same in every single type of country. That's very much not the case. The types of economies that exist in Africa, especially, are vastly different, where you have huge countries like Somalia, like Nigeria, countries who have actually quite a lot of income, countries that have a lot of people, are totally a different scenario to countries like, for example, the Central African Republic, who has essentially nothing and no one and is doing not anything. So it's important to be a little bit more nuanced than just assuming that all African countries are the same.
They're all
For different reasons. So, it's a trap. Yeah, it's a trap. Because do I need to go slower? What I'm trying to get at.
Raise an army.
Alright, even stop the puddle of that.
What I'm trying to get at though is kind of a broader argument. Unfortunately, when we decided to draw the map in Africa, we didn't really think a lot about it. We just kind of drew some lines and some kings took possession of some places and they stole a bunch of stuff from them. And that's all well and good. But essentially now, we're left with a whole bunch of countries that are not economically viable. They should never have been created. And now obviously the international community has a number of choices, one of which is to attempt to help support those economies despite the fact that they're really genuinely not viable and they should probably not be nation states. Another is perhaps to give up on that and just redraw the map. But that's advocated by only me. So, okay, the fourth thing that I want to talk about is the bad governance trap, which is obviously heightened in small countries, but also exists across the spectrum. This might sound sound like a stupid or obvious thing to say, but having a shitload of money is actually not useful unless you're spending it well. So if your solution to poverty in Africa is to just throw more money at it, regardless of the way it's spent, regardless of what it's spent on or who's in control of it, that solution is probably not going to work that effectively. This is great, I reckon this is something he points to in the book a couple of times. In 2004, they did a study of money that was released from the Ministry of Finance in Chad, and they found that only 1% of it actually got to where it was supposed to go. What happened to the other 99%? Nobody really knows. But I think the point is kind of crucial, which is governments spending money that you give them does not necessarily ensure the outcome of that spending will be anything, let alone good. Sorry, lost my train of thought. Yeah, so the other thing that he points to, which leads back to something we've already spoken about a little bit, is that statistically speaking, having a democracy actually just doesn't increase the likelihood of you having good governance and the policies you institute are good by virtue of the fact that patronage politics is essentially dominating in most places. The factors that actually do increase the likelihood of you getting it right are having a large population, which obviously you can't necessarily control, although perhaps you can, if that's a bit awkward. Having a high proportion of secondary educated people, and perhaps counterintuitively, having recently come out of conflict. We're going to come back to that last one in a second, but first, Stephen.
Well, given the large prevalence of traps across most of Africa, how large is the sample size that you conclude things like larger populations? Is it like one country with a large population has succeeded and one country with a small population?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. I'm obviously saying Africa because A, it's what I know most about, and B, it's where the majority of countries are, but it's not true that it's exclusively Africa. It also encompasses quite a bit of like Latin America and some countries still in Asia and so on and so forth. In terms of the sample size, like as with anything, there are only however many countries in the world, so like to some extent, thank you, Stephen. To some extent, the sample size is not ideal, but I think there are fairly compelling arguments made that these things are true. And I would advise you to read the book because it's based on very thorough research. I certainly wouldn't question. I don't think you should either.
There are 54 countries in Africa, so it's a reasonable sample size.
Precisely right. So the likelihood of a policy turnaround or a governance turnaround in any given year is about 1.6%, which means most countries that are failed states, whose governments don't really operate effectively, whose policies are total trash, will stay that way for a very, very long time, which is pretty grim. And the cost of failing states, Collier estimates to be about $100 billion. And again, that only really applies to itself and its direct neighbours, not the rest of the world, which obviously also is harmed by having failed states with governments who do not know what they're doing. Yes, Samuel.
Do you have an idea of the proportion of states in Africa that do have like a quasi-democratic government or the ones that like the autocratic?
Yeah, I mean, there'd absolutely be a number. The thing is that like quite a lot of them are quote-unquote democratic. We've kind of moved out of the 70s and 80s period of like your classic Idi Amin and Mugabe types, although I recognise Mugabe is still, you know, he's having a go. But the kind of ye-old dictator that you think about is kind of gone, by and large, in Africa. So most of them are at least quasi-democracies nowadays, which is why I think it's really important to engage in this. Democracy, insofar as its elections, has spread to most of Africa. The quality of those elections and the quality of the other things that go along with democracy that are not simply writing a thing on a piece of paper is very low. And so the international community perhaps has focused its efforts a little bit incorrectly in just trying to get people to vote and not worrying about all the other stuff that happens. The reason why poor governance and kind of the failure of state institutions is a trap is because it has a real effect on the type of people who are likely to stick around in your country. If a corrupt government takes over, or a government full of people who simply engage in patronage politics, where they pay people for support, and that's essentially all they do, and they don't particularly care about the population, they don't particularly care about growth or the effect they have on the rest of the population, people who are good, people who are educated, people who want reform, are unlikely to stay around in that context where they don't think they're going to have any impact. So it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where anyone you might have that's actually good in government, anybody who you might have that's actually pushing to get change instituted is likely to eventually give up because it's just too hard and they can't get anywhere. And Nigeria is a prime example where they've had quite a few quite smart people, especially in economic policy, who've then just gone on, they've given up on the Nigerian government, they've gone to work for like the World Bank or whatever. So it's a real big problem that essentially anyone who would engage in those things in a hostile environment is unlikely to stick around. So that's kind of hopefully giving you a bit of an overview of how bad the situation is. what I'm going to do now is hopefully try and give you some idea of some solutions. But I'm first going to check what the time is. Ooh. Okay, so A is a solution that not only has been adopted for many years, but it's a solution that's still advocated by many people. Philae, shut up. Thank you.
As well.
I'm going to try. Okay,
Okay.
let's talk about it. I'm going to try and get through this quickly. Many people misunderstand this, and I've seen many debates where this thing has been done wrong. So I'm hopeful that that will not happen again after today. So, what is aid? It can either be a grant of money that is not required to be paid back, or it can be a loan. I kid you not, almost all of you have fucked this up in front of me in a debate before. So sometimes loans are actually aid. It is not true that every single amount of money we give as aid never has to be repaid. Secondly, it can either be given to governments in those countries, or be given to individuals or communities. I've listed microfinance there as an example just because it's a classic one that we all love. It can be given to governments. Even if you choose governments as a vessel for the delivery of aid, you can give it to them in a number of different ways. You can give it to them as budget support, where you just hand them some money and say, do what you like, we hope this will really help. Or you can actually demarcate it for particular projects. So you can give it to governments on the assumption that they're going to spend it in a particular way that you think is good. It can be distributed through non-government organisations. It can be distributed through government departments, like for example AusAid or USAID or whatever. Or it can be distributed through international financial institutions like the World Bank and like the IMF, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And the final one here is about conditionality. People often refer to conditionality in debates without really thinking about what type of conditionality they're talking about. So, conditionality can either be ex ante if you want to use the real world, but like who cares, which is that a government promises to do something if you give them the aid. So you say, hey guy, we're going to give you the aid on the assumption that you are subsequently going to, I don't know, stop jailing gay people. Or it can be given ex post, which means that you would give it on the condition that governments have already met minimum standards of, for example, governance or policy or whatever. So there are a number of different ways in which you can deliver aid. That is the message. Look at this slide again later. Okay, so now that we've gone through that basic stuff, I'm not going to do a full Sunrack kind of story here, but what I will say is that the way aid is thought about is very dependent on where you sit on the kind of political spectrum. So for most kind of bleeding heart lefties, it's a question of guilt. Most of us feel really bad about colonialism, and I think we probably have some kind of duty to give back to Africa. That's not everybody, but that's certainly, I think, an underpinning theme of the way that the left approaches aid. The reason why right-wing people, by and large, don't like aid is because they just think it's more welfare dependence. That actually, what these people should do is just figure it out, like figure out how to be productive, make some money, and then they'll be fine on their own. Until now, to be perfectly honest, our aid programs have been relatively unsuccessful. At best, they've probably prevented collapse of countries, or at best, they've increased growth by, as I said earlier on that slide, about 1% on average a year, which is relatively minimal in the context of A, the length of time that we've been engaging in aid programs, and B, the amount of money overall that's been invested in aid. And we recently made a decision in 2005 to double aid. The problem with that, and obviously we've subsequently, or even previously to that, made a whole bunch of decisions to do debt relief and engage in a whole bunch of other programs. The problem with all of that leads back to what I said a little bit earlier, which is that giving more money does not fix the problem when that money is poorly spent. So obviously aid can be a part of the solution, and it absolutely should be, but that's only if we use it well and we spend it on things that are actually useful to the economy. So, some things to know about aid. It's absolutely subject to diminishing returns. So there is a point after which giving more money serves no additional function, which according to one think tank, it's about 16% of GDP. So once your country, about 16% of your GDP is made up by aid, it starts to pretty much have no effect, which is a bit worrying given we were already quite close to that for a lot of countries before we decided to double aid. So this is kind of what I'm trying to get at. Often the decision about giving aid is based on, for example, guilt, and not based on an objective look at the situation and what would actually solve the problems in these countries, which is a little bit problem. And as I've said 1,000 times already, we already have an experiment to tell us that simply injecting more money is probably not the solution, because plenty of countries that remain in the bottom billion and plenty of countries who do not grow have had many different phases in which they've gotten a huge injection of cash thanks to, for example, either previous aid or natural resources that has not really effectively worked. And as I said previously, the implication for debt relief is quite similar. Simply just freeing up a bunch of government money doesn't necessarily fix the problem unless you do anything to solve other systemic issues about how that money is going to be spent, how that country is going to operate, whether or not it's like, in civil war every other week. Unsurprisingly, aid is more successful in countries that have good governance. But the reason that's controversial is because usually those countries are the better off countries. Usually those countries are what we would perceive as more developed and less needy. And so there's a real push and pull, I guess, in even in the sphere of people who support giving aid about who it should go to, whether or not it should go to people who are most needy, but also into contexts where it's least likely to be effective, or whether or not it should go to countries that are already quasi-developed or have structures that can actually make use of additional money, even though they're perhaps less effective. And like what I've asked there is, do you think it would be effective for us to just dump a whole lot more money on Chad, given that maybe 1% of the money that the government spends in Chad actually gets to the place it should go? It's probably not a great use of money. There's a lot made of this in literature about the relationship between aid and military spending, so I thought I would quickly canvass it now. Obviously, most people who give aid don't like the idea of countries spending a lot of money on military things. So to some extent they try and avoid it, sometimes they condition aid to attempt to avoid it. By and large, it's impossible, because obviously, as all of you know, when you free up money in one part of the budget, you inevitably allow governments to spend money in other parts of the budget.
Would you say money is fundable?
That's exactly what I would say, Finlay. So, about as much as what is estimated to be about 11% of aid that goes to the bottom billion is spent on the military. Or, looking at that another way, in Africa, about 40% of all government military spending is financed by international aid. So, in a context in which conflict is rife, and in a context where it's a trap, you're in it, and also in a context where it's pretty easy to move guns from one place to another, and rebel movements don't tend to stay in one place, it's perhaps not a great thing that it kind of does fund a lot of this stuff. And then also the final quick note I just wanted to make is that where aid goes or how it's spent is highly politicised. A lot of donor organisations are very reticent to give aid or even engage with countries that are the worst off in the bottom billion, because they get their jobs and they get their bonuses by showing outcomes, and it's pretty hard if you're giving money to like the Central African Republic to say, look at all this success I'm having, because obviously the country is in the sticks. So it's actually quite a political decision where governments give aid in the first place. Also, there's huge linkages with like post-colonial history. Countries are much more likely to fund due to guilt, countries they used to colonise, etc. I'm going to quickly talk about aid and its relationship to the traps, which I know
Oh, here we go.
delight peanut gallery here. So, aid in the conflict trap. Let's talk about it quickly. Some people argue that it increases the payoff of taking control of governments. So, Collier's experience is that, especially with regards to coups, huge aid inflows actually make things like a coup more likely. The reason why is because coups are relatively easy. If you get it right, it's a pretty easy and painless thing. It's like, one day you're not the Prime Minister and the next day you are. And so, I'll slow down too. So, yeah, he argues that if you've got access to huge international aid, that actually increases the appeal of those particular things, which is perhaps not a good thing in the context of it being a trap. That's right, I said it. But on the other hand, obviously, if aid actually works effectively, then it can increase growth and it can increase GDP and it can increase income, which moves you away from being engaged in those types of things, which is good. In terms of natural resources, aid is fairly fucking useless. They have a lot of money, most places that have a shitload of natural resources. Unsurprisingly, money, or more of it more importantly, is not the issue and it's not the solution to the problem of countries that have bad governance and who are engaged in a whole bunch of conflict and, wastage. In terms of being landlocked, as I said already, Collier's opinion is basically that aid is the only, or one of the only solutions. You just have to keep giving them money because they essentially cannot function as an economy. Although obviously there are things we can do to make aid more effective, to actually, help these countries potentially get out of that trap. And in terms of governance, I'm not going to go through all of this because there's a lot of detail, but the overall argument that's made by Collier, which I think is made quite compellingly, is one of the best forms of aid is actually in terms of technical assistance. It's in terms of paying people to go and assist governments who are already in the process of reform and who are already trying to get better, but probably don't have sufficient capability themselves of instituting good policies. There's a huge backlash against this because people really think it looks like colonialism. It's just like, perhaps we'll send some people to tell you how to do things better because we're a lot smarter than you. And so that means that it's quite a controversial thing, but in terms of the impact it has on especially countries that are already reforming and moving away from bad policies and bad governance, Collier thinks it's basically the number one thing. And you can look at the details of these slides later. He essentially makes the argument that it's important to use aid at the right time in the development of a country. So there's essentially no point throwing money at countries that are likely to, in the next couple of years, get back into conflict. It's important to stage it correctly. He does say, though, that as soon as a country gets out of conflict, that's the best time to put in money because that's obviously their most vulnerable period. And if you can increase things like GDP and things like growth during that period, then you're much more likely to stem them kind of devolving back into conflict. To give you a little bit of the other side very quickly, aid is quite controversial and there are hugely differing opinions in the kind of sphere of economics about whether or not it's good. As Tim already told you about before, we've already mentioned some of these people. Dambisa Moyo is quite famous because she's actually African, and so people like her because perhaps she has a bit more credibility. Her book, Debt Aid, to be as reductive as I possibly can, essentially makes the argument that you close out private investment when you have huge aid, that it signals to the market that your economy is crap and that you'll always be dependent on aid and that you're not actually going to function properly. She makes the argument that there is a demand for investment in the bottom billion, or in sub-Saharan Africa to be specific, and that countries, if they didn't rely on aid and if they weren't dependent on aid, they would actually get off their arse and they would try to appeal to international investors, and that would be better for their economy in the long run. William Easterly, who wrote The White Man's Burden, essentially claims that it's colonisation once over again and we should let countries figure it out on their own. Again, that's very reductive of like an entire book. Collier makes the argument though that any well-rounded solution is probably going to include some aid. Jeffrey Sachs is the big kind of international proponent of aid. If anyone's interested, and his book that is all about love and aid is here if you want to borrow it. Alright, let's talk about trade. Collier's argument is that trade, and essentially free trade, is a really good solution to some of these problems, which is perhaps surprising to you. His argument is that everybody needs to reduce protectionism, though, in order for it to be effective. So rich countries, if they want to help countries trade their way out of these awful positions, actually need to be willing to take a hit themselves. In a second, we're going to look at the WTO and we're going to look at how that exactly hasn't happened. But obviously, there is a potential that it might in some future that is not likely to ever occur. But maybe it will. Also, he makes the argument that if that were to be the case, bottom billion countries could also reduce protectionism and engage in genuinely free trade. The reason why he says this is a potentially good solution is because, unsurprisingly, if your country is incredibly poor, you do not have a significant level of domestic demand. There are not people with money who want to buy the stuff that your economy can produce, especially in the instance where you're stuck in one of those traps that we talked about earlier. So he basically makes the argument that the only way you're ever going to develop meaningfully is to be able to export stuff to countries where there is sufficient demand for your products, and then that will eventually mean that people are employed, that you then have a sufficient amount of money in the economy to create some degree of domestic demand. But essentially, I think to kind of boil the argument down to its most basic element, it's quite a compelling thing to say that if your country is shit, being protectionist is probably not that useful because there's no one there who's actually likely to buy the crap that you are peddling. I'm going through this very quickly. He makes the argument that if you're going to use aid as a part of the solution to these problems, that it's actually best accompanied by trade liberalisation. There's no point in flooding a whole bunch of aid into markets that are totally protectionist. For some of the reasons we've already spoken about before, which essentially is Dutch disease, that aid functions quite similarly in that it gives the government a whole bunch of money that it then has to spend in the economy, that it then has to exchange, driving up the value of that currency and therefore harming that stuff we already spoke about. So it's quite cyclical in that sense. There is a whole explanation here of how that process works in a technical way. I'm not going to go through it now because I don't have time, but I will send you these slides. some people say that trade is the solution only to the extent that it's fair trade. And we've all heard of fair trade because everybody's had fair trade coffee, and that's essentially what we know about it. And that's half the reason why it's probably not a great solution to anything. Collier's argument, which I personally agree with, is that, like, at best, having things like fair trade, which is where we theoretically or nominally pay a higher price that is more fair to the producer, it pretty much locks countries into producing the types of things that fair trade consumers will buy. And so the big one and the most obvious one is coffee. There are a whole bunch of countries in sub-Saharan Africa who could produce things other than coffee, but because they get a nominally and very marginally higher rate for producing coffee, they tend to continue to produce coffee in order to avoid the short-term harm of changing their economy and diversifying and producing other things. But obviously, ultimately, that doesn't actually develop them much. So he argues that it's not really a great solution. But what is, perhaps, is export diversification, which is stuff that we've already spoken about, and is fairly usual and obvious economic theory. Final thing with regards to trade is about regional integration. I'm going to talk about this a lot in my thing about international institutions, so we'll kind of come back to it then. But basically, his argument is a couple-fold. First of all, if the region that you exist in is total shit, getting involved in some kind of regional organisation has a fairly low kind of ceiling in terms of the likelihood of development. In reality, you're not going to develop out of being an incredibly poor country when the region that you exist in and the regional organisation that you're a part of is full of other poor countries that have similar kind of fundamental and systemic issues to you. And he actually does a comparison to the EU and says the reason why the EU was by and large effective, to be fair, I think you might have written this before the recent crisis, but regardless, the reason why he argues the EU is by and large effective is because there was a huge difference in the economies that participated. So there was actual gains to be made by the poorer countries in converging with the countries at the top. Arguably, in sub-Saharan Africa, that's unlikely to happen, and so realistically, you're unlikely to get anywhere. He also makes the argument, though, that in a regional grouping of poor countries, the country that's likely to benefit the most is the most well off, because it's the country that can actually produce the most, and like essentially won't do anything for the poor countries. Again, there's a lot more detail on the slide that I'm not going to go through. He also makes the argument, which we will come back to in a second, that the bottom billion should essentially leave the WTO and give up on attempting to negotiate trade with the Western world in the way that it currently operates. So WTO right now works, in theoretical sense anyway, on the basis of mutual gain and on the basis of reciprocal trade liberalisation. So obviously, in order to negotiate with countries like the United States or blocs like the EU, you have to have a market that actually means something to them. By and large, Sub-Saharan Africa does not have that, and so its negotiating position in, for example, its national institution is pretty much nil. Quickly, military intervention. He points to a whole bunch of different ones. The point here, and it, unsurprisingly, is that sometimes it's a good idea and sometimes it's not a good idea. We need to be a little bit smart about when we do it and how we do it in order to maximise the likelihood that it's successful. So he points to some things that we've done well, like, for example, providing security guarantees to ensure that coups don't occur. It's a really inexpensive and a really easy thing for us to do, to say to a government, we will come and we will put you back into power if you are taken over by a coup, and it's something that has been shown to be relatively effective. In a lot of these places, military, in a domestic sense, is insufficient to stop or avoid conflict. For a start, half the time coups come from the military themselves, so often you need some kind of external arbiter to avoid that thing occurring. Also, sometimes they just don't exist at all and they're totally underfunded. And in terms of the cost, given what is already estimated to be the cost of things like civil war, not even including the cost that it has ultimately to the United States or the EU, in terms of terrorism, in terms of piracy, in terms of a whole bunch of other stuff, basically he says, yes, there is definitely an argument for military intervention to improve countries, to make sure that they are kind of out of the conflict trap for long enough that their economies can grow and they're unlikely to fall back into it. Final thing he proposes is a whole bunch of laws and charters. I'm going to be quick here, but I think there are some really good examples of ways that we might regulate ourselves a little bit better to avoid some of the colossal fuck-ups that occur in the developing world or in the bottom billion. So a prime example being the way our banks operate. This is it just twists me every single time. So in 2004, it was discovered that a bank in DC had accepted a whole bunch of stolen money from a dictator in Equatorial Guinea, and they just didn't want to give it back. And the population was like, hey, guy, can we have it back because it was stolen? And unsurprisingly, the bank was like, nah, we would like to keep it. And that's a prime example, and there are plenty of other ones, e.g. that second one there about London and Swiss banks, of how we might, for example, force our own banks to report if dictators put a shitload of stolen money into their banks. Or alternatively, we might actually make it a little bit easier for countries to get back the money that was stolen from them, as opposed to our bankers benefiting off the total degradation of like a billion people. So that's something we could potentially do differently. Yes, Stephen?
I was just going to say, and it's probably a little bit broader than that, just specific area,
Yeah.
but I think what's been recently in the news is Swiss banks are now thinking of introducing new legislation about the regulation of their banks, because I think it's because the FBI have now ordered so many freezes on so many accounts that are being afforded that actually the Swiss banks are now having trouble operating
Yeah.
as a result of the fact that so many injunctions are being awarded. So they're actually now going to introduce, or thinking about introducing, who knows,
Yeah.
more regulation over, mostly about tracking down like people who avoid tax in Europe. But I presume
Yeah, see, I think
yeah.
the problem being that a lot of those freezes are to do with like self-interested stuff, e.g. people avoiding tax, or e.g. us thinking they're terrorists, as opposed to us knowing they're a dictator who stole a bunch of money and just not really caring enough to freeze the money and to give it back to the company. The next example, which I ranted with Finlay about for like an hour when I found this out, is that until quite recently, when a French company bribed a government official outside of France, that shit was taxable. Like, the French company would be like, yeah, we were doing a really great thing. Like, we might be a lot more productive now. So perhaps what we could do is not incentivize utter corruption in Sub-Saharan Africa. Those are just my thoughts about some things we might change. Seems like a good idea. So, basically, in conclusion to a lot of that ranting stuff, if we're going to do anything effective to actually fix the fairly huge problems in the bottom billion, it's no good having decisions about things like aid and about things like trade made in a whole bunch of different and disparate government departments, especially in the context in which the development department of most Western governments is like at the bottom of the rung and no one gives a shit what they have to say. Like, they don't affect the executive whatsoever. So what Collier says, and what I think is fairly sensible, is that we need some kind of coordinated approach where a whole bunch of different government departments who do different things and perhaps have a little bit more respect than like AusAid are engaged in making solutions. And then secondly, we need to think about the particular contexts of countries and develop a solution that deals with the things that happen in that country, as opposed to just assuming every African country is the same, and if we give them more money, we'll feel less bad, and we won't really worry about what the outcome of that thing is. Alright, that's the end of presentation 1. Are there questions? Stephen?
Sorry, I have early. So obviously the vast majority of this debate is about development aid as opposed to humanitarian aid.
Yes.
Although there are probably arguments also about whether or not you should provide specific humanitarian aid, like the mosquito net example in whatever. Like if you provide everybody with mosquito nets, then local mosquito net manufacturers go.
Absolutely, I mean, by and large that's considered development aid.
Yeah. Oh really? Oh, there you go. So it's humanitarian aid. Just
Humanitarian aid is like, you have been flooded, we will now give you some dollars to house the people who are like, I don't know, in your local stadium or like on your local street.
Cool. But the thing that I was mostly going to ask is that, like, one of the biggest contentions of David Samoya's thesis, I suppose, is that the thing that third world nations should do is start to repay aid as opposed to having it forgiven, given that that is in itself one of the traps.
Yes.
Obviously, like I think concedes that that's quite an extreme proposal, given a flip from what we've been considering in the past.
Yeah.
But do you think advocating that kind of like actual system of repayment is?
So I think it's very dependent on the type of country you're talking about, and I think perhaps that's one of the problems with, to be honest, a lot of these different people and the theories they advance, which I don't think is true for Collier, which is they should just lump all the countries into the one basket. So the reality is that not every country in Sub-Saharan Africa is going to have any international demand for investment. Like, there are some countries that are too far gone, to be honest, that I think people are likely to want to invest, or those countries are likely to be able to put something together to court international investors. So I think that her proposal is certainly true perhaps for some countries that are in that position, but I highly doubt it's true for all. In the same way that trade is true for some countries, in that they might have actual productive capacity, they might have stuff to sell, and they might be able to benefit from some kind of trade liberalisation, but not at all true for countries who have zero economy and who have nothing that they produce. In the same way that we need a different solution for countries that are landlocked, etc., they're never going to be able to access that kind of trade market. So I think the problem with Jambix and Moyo and a lot of these other people is they tend to be fairly broad brush and not look at the specifics of how it would play out. To be fair, she does give quite a lot of anecdotal examples of how it has played out in particular countries, and I won't cancel now.
Botswana.
You should read the book. Yeah, although Botswana is like the number one anomaly in Africa. It's pretty much the poster child for Africa, and it's fine to say, oh, just be a bit more like Botswana, but there was kind of a number of things that occurred to allow Botswana to be true as a country, and all the other countries around to kind of fall apart. So, yeah, I think that it certainly has a role, but it's probably not a solution in all cases, as opposed to some very specific cases. Yes, Olivia?
Yeah, very good question. With most of the aid in the past, you know how you were saying there's two types of aid, so like that they'll reform after they get aid,
Yeah.
and the second one, which is like they reach a certain level and
Yeah.
get aid. I'm assuming most of it has been the first kind because they're just so.
Yeah, I mean it's been kind of half and half, but Collier pretty much says that taking promises from bad governments that they will reform after we give them money is a very dumb idea. And he points to an example where the World Bank gave Kenya 5 different loans on the basis of the same promise to do a thing, and Kenya kept not doing it, and the World Bank kept going, hey, you want some more money? Will you do this thing? And like obviously that's a pretty extreme example, but I think the point is pretty obvious, which is that once governments already have access to the money, their incentives to reform the stuff are relatively limited, and so especially in the context where we've kind of created some degree of moral hazard because we've just kept like loaning them money anyway, or giving them grants anyway. It's really not a great idea to do that.
Type would probably incentivize the government.
Yeah, so the second kind might do that, but obviously, as I said, the controversy with regards to that is that it does kind of affect countries that are a little bit better off, and so you don't necessarily target
He
the
will
worst off.
suck it as he tries to suck it.
Okay, any more questions?